O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about religion in the 21st century, part 2. And this was inspired again by my wonderful conversation with Dimitri, Lehman, and Cadell on Absolute Spirit, Dimitri's channel. And we've already spoken in part 1 about how we're focusing, it seems, religion today needs to focus on social agents more so than social arrangements. And please note the word social and social agent. So we're not just talking about individual realization. It's a question of how the individual socially relates. And we've also pointed out that we need to figure out a way to talk about religion that is distinct from, say, social arrangements. And I think religion is probably going to have a lot to do with the training of practices by which to deal with the other, by which to deal with ourselves as subjects before the other, and our own path, our own psychoanalytical issues that are very difficult to work through. And so I think religion and the real must be very, very tied together. And I really like how Cadell puts it, like religion seems to be the mediation of instincts over a lifetime. I think that's true. And I think it has something to do with the mediation of relations over a lifetime between people. And you could say that society does that. And yes, it does to a certain degree. But I think society often mediates relationships through law, or, say, guilt, or obligations, and things like that. And belonging, again, is all about the loss of givens. And so it's the social organization is not given. And that being the case, it would seem to be that social organization is going to have a lot more to do with skills, treatments, ways of carrying ourselves before others, where it's not given that we have shared intelligibility. It's not given that we think similarly. So what is the given way that we are going to act when we encounter that unknown? So there's this movement of givens as ground to kind of givens as acts, and that's also going to be captured as a movement from givens as ground to gifts, which is kind of like how do we gift one another? And what are the gifts that they give to us in return? So this movement from givenness as ground to givenness as relation, and that being what is kind of the given way we collectively act when we face that, which is unknown and surprising. But that, of course, is going to be more so in the realm of social agents than it is going to be in the arena of social arrangements, as Mr. Wolff talks about in his masterpiece, Embrace, Exclusion and Embrace. So we seem to be in the business of skills, acts, things like that. And in the book, in Desiring the Kingdom, Dr. James K.A. Smith asks a series of questions that I think must be asked if we are to meaningfully and constructively ask about religion in the 21st century, which again, for me, is to ask about society in the 21st century. I think these questions are similar, and it's also why asking about religion can be productive. Engaging in what he calls cultural exegesis, Dr. Smith writes, "What vision of human flourishing is implicit in this or that practice? What does the good life look like as embedded in cultural rituals? What sort of person will I become after being immersed in this or that cultural liturgy?" Mr. Smith, Dr. Smith, in his book, he talks about liturgies like going to the mall. When you go to the mall, it works on your loves, and if it works on your loves, it works on your habits, and habits form character. So we always have to be aware of the liturgies we put ourselves amidst and in, and we have to think about culture as cultural liturgies, as full of liturgies, things working on our desires and our loves. And if we're not aware of that, we're going to be made into people whom we don't even know how we ended up as. We're going to end up as people who, well, we didn't mean to end up as, or didn't think to end up as. And so Dr. Smith really emphasizes cultural liturgies. And so there is something, what's interesting about this is there is something about social arrangements that are relevant to social agents, but we have to think about social arrangements and institutions as liturgies for the formation of social agents. We have to think about making institutions for the sake of the kinds of people we want to make, not as things to do our believing for us, if we will. That tends to be what we do, where we go, oh, there's a church over there, church is meeting every Sunday, therefore there's legitimacy to my Christian beliefs. And they kind of function ideologically. They kind of function as ways to sustain our worldview. But really we need to think about these places as training us, as more like gymnasiums. And it is interesting to think so much of early philosophy took place in a gymnasium and seems to have been linked with wrestling and sports, which then ties back to Mark Edmondson's book on football. and what it taught him. The paper then is going to list some of the possible skills which will be needed for social agents or Nietzschean children, which is what Belonging in Part 2 is going to be exploring, these kind of social agents and the institutions, pricing mechanisms, so on and so forth, needed to support social agents as they go about learning these skills. And some examples of the skills that I think that we need, frankly, would be stuff like integration with lack, such as described in the Philosophy of Lack series, which can be found on Cadell's channel. The attention of Simone Weil, which I think her concept of attention is really powerful. The proper confidence of Leslie Newbegin over fragile certainty. This is discussed in The Conflict of Mind as well, and this paper will get into this too. I think this one that Wolff talks about, the capacity for non-exclusionary judgments, the capacity to struggle against exclusion without perpetuating exclusion by the very struggle against it. I think this is really tricky. How do you judge something as wrong and not exclude in that very act? And maybe you should exclude in that act, but maybe you shouldn't. It's very tricky, very tricky. And Wolff will talk a little bit about Girard. I think then with Mr. Smith, the conscious cultivation of habits according to a logic of love and liturgy, a new vision of sexuality that would be taking serious, say, Zupancha and maybe Lacan and perhaps John Paul II with the theology of the body. I think also we have to cultivate meta skills. These have come up in some of the topic conversations I've had with, say, Emilio, Tom Leon, Andrew Luber. Improvisation, I think, is important. This came up with Emilio in Topics 4. I think we also have to learn to make the absolute choice, which is described in the book, The Absolute Choice, and also came up in the conference, the Philosophy Portal Conference on the Phenomenology of Spirit. I think prayer as sacrifice, sacrifice in general is important, and you could even get into the phenomenology of voice with Tim Adlin in the skills of voice, and seeing voice as bringing forth something of great relevance, and so on and so forth. I think if religion is going to be useful under pluralism, it will have something to do with encountering otherness, with all of these skills. And then, of course, the question of forgiveness emerges too. Like, there's going to be something with these skills, with these abilities, with these ways of carrying ourselves in the world that religion is going to have to cultivate, to be religion and not just, say, a restaurant, a social arrangement where, maybe we go bowling together or we hang out, and all of that is good. None of that is necessarily bad. But if we're talking about religion in the 21st century, it would seem to me that it needs to really focus on these kind of abilities. All this in mind, another reason I think we need these kind of abilities is we have to avoid being captured by the everydayness, the kind of going about a business without thinking about it, that you could see in Heidegger critiquing and warning about, and Merold Westphal, who also is a tremendous Hegel scholar. He talks about Heidegger in his book, I believe, Guilt, God, Guilt, and Death. And he points out that Heidegger understood how everydayness could be a bondage of the will even more fundamental than the acquired habits which weighed Augustine down. And you see, that's really problematic. You just you just go about everydayness, and it never breaks, like that working doorknob. But, if you can become aware of the sacred and be powerfully drawn toward its promise of an eternal happiness and toward the transformation of our existence, which goes with that, we will find everydayness to be a power resisting that movement and change. So here's the thing, like if you believe in God, then there is a natural tendency to see everydayness as a threat. But if you don't believe in God, how do you do that? And the other can have this role, but then we have to learn to encounter the other. And so all of these skills become really important so that we can do that. There's an argument to be made that without these skills, which seem necessary if we're going to be Hegelian or Deleuzian or Nietzschean or like Christ, that without these skills we're not going to be able to avoid the capture of the everyday. And if we do, if the everyday breaks, we'll probably respond pathologically. So how do we develop ourselves in a manner to handle the everyday breaking? But then on the flip side, that not result in us breaking away and getting lost in abstraction. That's what, that's arguably a tendency of religion in the 20th century and earlier is that religion helps us break out of the everyday, but then unfortunately it can help us break away from the everyday. And that's not what we want. We want to be broken out of everydayness while still part of the everyday, per se. And this seems very difficult. I think all of these skills ultimately are going to entail sacrifice and an acceptance of human limitation and the requirement of accepting the other. In Tragic Sense of Life by Michael Unamuno, Unamuno, he tells us, it sounds very Hegelian, that consciousness of oneself is simply consciousness of one's own limitation. To know and to feel the extent of my being is to know at what point I cease to be, the point beyond which I no longer am. And perhaps one of the reasons we don't like these skills and we don't like cultivating social agency is precisely because it requires this acceptance of a point where we no longer are. That's what the other is. And especially when the other wrongs us. When the other is like us, although we know that the other marks a point where we end, it also kind of feels like we extend into them. So it's not this pronounced feeling of loss or the real. But when we're dealing with the other who wrongs us, then the existence of the other is very pronounced. And I definitely think the problem of forgiveness that could be central to 20th century religion. I don't think we've thought it. I don't know if we've taken it seriously. And it's quite dire. Unamuno, he asks this wonderful question. He says, how do we know that we exist if we do not suffer, little or much? As if suffering is needed for existence. And it brought a phrase to mind where if we could say that in a sense philosophy is I think, therefore I am, perhaps religion is I suffer, therefore I am. And perhaps what we see today is this bringing together of religion and philosophy. Therefore, the philosopher must suffer as the religious must think, if both are to fully be. But it might be helpful to think about religion as having something to do with being through suffering. And then you could align that with the phenomenological journey, as Gödel talks about regarding Hegel, which, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, it's the stations of the cross he constantly talks about, and that seems to be quite appropriate. And, for Hegel, consciousness knows and comprehends only what falls within its experience, but spirit becomes object because it is the movement of becoming an other to itself, i.e. becoming an object to itself, that of suspending this otherness. So, these practices we've described seem to have a lot to do with coming to terms with otherness, which would require coming to terms with limitation, and that is going to come to see consciousness. It's going to be an object to itself. It's not going to be the center of everything. It's going to be other to itself, and thus something that can be other to others. And then that means they can be other to us, but part of us in that very act, because if consciousness is that the consciousness the other has is similar to my consciousness, it's not qualitatively different, then we can start to relate according to a new quality. And this new quality, achieving it, seems to have a lot to do with the goals of 21st century religion. But of course, this will require stations of the cross. It must be the case that it proves to be a suffering that makes us thus. I suffer, therefore I am. And then we could say, what better way to learn the limits of ourself than to be tackled on the football field, right? Sports has a way of teaching you that other people really do exist because they just beat you on the wrestling mat. They just forced you to give your all. There's something about sports that make other people really, really deeply real. And so I think this idea that I suffer, therefore I am, speaks to the overlay between religion and sports. And that brings us to Edmondson's Burke. And, some of the lessons he learned in football that I think religion today will have to teach us and will teach us in the act of creating the spaces where we can learn the skills that were listed above and others. Some of those lessons that Edmondson put forth. So in the same way that, like in sports, it is on the field you also learn skills for being on the field, the question becomes, how can religion be a field on which we learn certain skills? And so the gaining of lessons and the gaining of skills all kind of go together. And we see that in sports, and I think religion has to do something similar. And, some of the lessons that Edmondson talks about, he makes this point, just to kind of list them out. The paper has a little list here. He says, I was willing to sweat and strain like a country mule all that summer in pursuit of a goal, but I couldn't take one simple, sincere piece of advice that might have closed the deal for me. Edmondson refused to wear sports glasses in his helmet because they looked ridiculous, but then, of course, he couldn't really see. And so it's kind of this idea that sometimes we rather work hard than be humble, and we need to not do that, basically. He also says, I recognize myself a capacity for violence that's well beyond that of most middle-class guys in middle age, and I have to be vigilant about it. So how do we be vigilant about our own internal violence? He talks about how sports can teach you that you can really dread something while also loving it. That's an important lesson. I cried in my sleep one night at the thought that the next day I would have to go back to practice. So how can we be the kind of subject that can love and hate something at the same time? I think religion has to think that. He talks about where his coach said, son, run through your pads, run through your pads. And when he really got that made a big difference. So he tried to run through his pads. The closing of the subject-object divide can go a long way to making us full subjects. How can religion teach something similar? And then he also had this really interesting reflection on character when Dr. Edmondson writes, character is about wall building. It can grant security, autonomy, a stable life, but it imprisons you too. What we call character can be the enemy of imagination, empathy, invention, and of plain pleasant dreaminess. Character preserves, but it also limits and depletes. Often it does both at the same time. The coaches may not tell you so, but it's true. And this is a tragic trade-off of character, and Belonging again certainly talks about the tragic trade-off of givens of character and so on and so forth, and religion is going to have to think this tragic trade-off. So these are just some examples of the kind of lessons sports can give us, that are tragic, that religion will have to do something similar. Some more examples are given, but the point is made that there is no way to systemize a football game. Yes, you can be systematic in our play calling, our strategies and the like, but ultimately a football game is live, and we require both. And we require fresh assessments, decisions, actions every single time. I think Karl Barth, the great Christian theologian, he wrote in a letter, June 6, 1948, and he says, the church never thinks, speaks, or acts on principle. Rather, it judges spiritually and by individual cases. For that reason, it rejects every attempt to systemize political history and its own part in that history. It preserves the freedom to judge each new event afresh. This can sound weak and relativistic, admittedly, but I think we can understand what Karl Barth's getting at if we think a football game. A football game never unfolds on principle. There are principles, yes, but they hardly make up the whole game, and you can't predict the game based on the principles. The game is live, unpredictable, and messy. And so it goes with religion, not because we are weak in our convictions, but because convictions are not the central exercise of religion. Skills are, and skills are always messy. That's partly what makes them skills. But that means also there's going to be the possibility of mistake and error, but as we'll get into, where there is no error or possibility of mistake, there's no possibility of contact with reality. Now, this points, though, to some problems we're going to have with the skills of the 21st century religion, because these are not observable skills like woodcutting, fixing cars, throwing a pass in football. These skills, which help us integrate with lack and open to the other, will often prove invisible, individual, and unknowable outside the situation in which they are practiced, which will lead into the problem of authority and so on and so forth. So, we're talking about the need for skills, but these are very invisible skills. How do you see the skill or determine the skill or even rate the skill or be sure that the skill is present of, say, Simone Weil's attention or so on and so forth? This seems very tricky. Krishnamurti, he tells us, life is a battle of ideas, a battle of influence, and your mind is the field of that battle. The politician wants your mind, the guru wants your mind. The saint says, do this and not that, and he always wants your mind. In every tradition, every form of habit or custom, influence shapes, guides, controls your mind. So it's all the battlefield of the mind, but how to fight on the battlefield of the mind is mostly invisible. So how do you know if you have the skills, and how do you know if the people around you have the skills? Now, and also, like, the rules of football are football basically is the rules, and they're there. If you don't know the rules of football, other people can force you to still play by them, or penalize you according to them, or let you know you're not playing them. But the rules of the mind, you might have to think the rules for the rules to be there, and you might have to have a number of people in a community who agree on said rules. This seems very difficult. How do we go about doing this? This is going to be one of the challenges of 21st century religion. So indeed, a lot of this 21st century religion seems to be in the realm of the battlefield of the mind, which then makes you go, oh, we're talking education in school, and yeah, there always seems to be a lot of overlap between education and religion. But religion seems to be the education of the real and the subject, not just information. That seems to be an important change. Nishanti, he writes that water is neither the life of the fish as such, nor its body, and yet it is essentially linked to both of them. Likewise, thought is neither the life of a person nor the body of a person, and yet thought is essentially linked to keeping us alive and enabling our bodies to act creatively, spiritually, and constructively. As water is and isn't divisible from the fish, so thought is and isn't divisible from us, and so it is easy for us to forget about our need to prioritize it and win on its battlefield. Religion of the 21st century must not let us forget this reality, and it must help us also master it. But by what metric, according to what authority, who can say? And this is where it gets really tricky, because we're going to now, this all suggests the problem of authority and metric, and who do we determine has authority? Well, in wrestling, who has authority basically by the guy who wins the match. You can see it. It's right in front of you. It's not really debatable. It's there. So the facticity is very facticity-based. The authority. So the authority is very facticity-based, but how do you judge the effectiveness of meta skills like Simone Weil's attention? Well, it would seem like you'd have to have a community of people who agree that attention is a skill that matters, and also who have the ability to identify it and thus judge when it is used and judge when it is used well. So there seems to be this collective need of people being able to recognize these meta skills and to judge their implementation as well or good. So that's going to be tricky, but it seems to be part of the equation. And that would also suggest that authority has to be gifted from others to a person. It's not so much a person can say, I'm the authority because I have the meta skills. Other people need to confirm that authority. But that would require them to recognize the meta skills and to judge it effectively. And then the paper gets a little bit into this difference. It's interesting that you have authority, author, and authoritarian. And we have to avoid being authoritarian and instead have authority. And that means if we're going to have authority, we need to be like Hector instead of Achilles, because Achilles is authoritarian. But there's a problem with Hector, and that is that Hector loses. But before we get into all of that, we're going to have to talk about Leslie Newbegin's work on proper confidence and Michel Plonier's and his work of personal knowledge, both of which is very important for this question of 21st century religion. For more about O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. And thank you so much for your time.